Hi there, everybody. My name is Harry Olafsen. I'm a second year English MA student, and I'm here with the Center for Violence Prevention Education and the Center for Women and Gender Equity presenting the It's On Us teach-in entitled Identifying Abuse and Violence in Gay Male Relationships. Just before we get started, there's some hashtags down there and some contact information, which I have throughout the presentation. So before we get into it, this is not working as I want it. There we go. Just some quick notes. Since the second annual It's On Us teaching was canceled due to COVID-19, I partnered with the Center for Violence Prevention and Education and Center for Women and Gender Equity to bring my presentation to you virtually. So please consider getting involved during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. All April folks are invited to participate in a virtual 5K, take a photo during your run, and add the hashtag BGSU SAAM 2020 and BGSU Virtual and share a fact about sexual violence. And the CVPE has additional great opportunities for virtual engagement, and please like them on Facebook to stay involved, and the contact information is right there. And just some general housekeeping before we get started. This presentation is pre-recorded, but I will make sure you have my contact information if you have any questions or comments. It's on the first slide, it's right here, oharry@bgsu.edu, and it's at the end. So there's a lot of chances to have that contact information if you need anything or have any questions. So just before we get started, a trigger warning. This presentation deals with physical, emotional, and verbal abuse. It will also include some details on physical violence. So if that is uncomfortable for you, you're unable to continue, that is fine. Feel free to click off now. If you would like to pause and look through the different slides before we get to talking, that's fine as well. If you need it right here, there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline and that contact information. And there is a list of contact information at the very end of the presentation as well. So, where is the scholarship on sexual violence in gay male relationships? Well, it's way behind. So there's been more that has come out within the past couple of years, but it's nowhere near the same amount as the heterosexual couples and information on domestic abuse in heterosexual relationships. The scholarship is extremely limited. There are very, very few actual tangible sources that we can get our hands on. It has not been studied, it has not been widely published about, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as we continue and see why that might be happening. And there's even less representation in lesbian, bisexual, and transgender relationships. So for gay men, it's still, there's not a lot of scholarship at all, but just think for lesbian, bisexual, transgender people, it's even less. So we have a long way to go in terms of understanding what sexual violence looks like in these relationships. And we have a long way to go to have proper representation before we can understand what domestic abuse looks like in these relationships. But in this presentation, I'm using a blend of scholarship, government reports, and journalism to offer support and additional resources. Basically, what I could find what I could get my hands on, what I could find to bring to you today, just to back up what I'm trying to tell you and get across. So one of the biggest sources that we have is the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. So this survey is probably like the leading survey on intimate partner violence and sexuality in conversation with each other. And it was conducted in 2010. So this is about 10 years ago. So we're pretty outdated at this point, but it is the most up-to-date survey that we have that connects partner violence and sexuality in this way. It details lesbian, gay, and bisexual relationships. It doesn't really touch on transgender relationships or people who are transgender in any sort of relationship that they may be in. So there is a limitation there, and there's room for further research that we need to address. But sticking with the line of gay male relationships, gay men reported levels of intimate partner violence and sexual violence equal to or higher than those of heterosexuals. Commonly across the scholarship, the argument seems to be that gay men experience it at higher rates, and anybody in the LGBTQ community experiences sexual violence at higher rates than the heterosexual community. 78.6% of gay men who experience sexual violence other than rape in their lifetime reported having only male perpetrators, which is also important because that's something that we commonly see in heterosexual relationships. It is typically a male perpetrator. I think the survey said it's close to 98% of the time. That's not an exact percentage, but it's roughly around 98%. Rape and physical violence and stalking is about 26% of gay men surveyed had said they had that experience in a relationship. And then severe physical violence, which I'll touch on later, but this is their language that they use, which is more physical. I think they gave some examples like hair pulling, physical hitting, like altercations, which was about 16.4% of the gay men surveyed said that they had this sort of experience as well. So this is a large percentage of the population surveyed, and it is broken down later on. And it's important to note that these numbers are even higher for bisexual men and women and lesbian women. So these percentages I gave you are typically higher in those relationships. And then, as I said earlier, this data does not represent transgender or gender nonconforming individuals, which is something that needs to be done in the future. So this is from that same survey that we're still on. So this is just the lifetime prevalence of physical violence by an intimate partner based on sexual orientation for men. So they have this broken down for men and women in the survey, which I have linked at the very end of the presentation. So again, we see the physical violence on the right-hand side. I'm not sure if you'll see this. I'm trying to spin around with the cursor. That's basically slapped, punched, or shoved, which is about 24%. You can see the number of victims there. And you can see for gay, bisexual, and heterosexual men. For right now, we're just going to stick with gay men because that's what this presentation is focused on, but those numbers are there for you to see, to compare, and to get an idea. So we see slapped, pushed, or shoved. So this is the severe physical violence. This survey doesn't take into account emotional abuse as much as physical abuse because this is something that's quantitative, it can be counted. So any severe physical violence we see there. So roughly 447,000 gay men who participate in the study have had some sort of experience with severe physical violence in some way. So bring that into the general population, we can see where those numbers kind of lie. And again, this is 10 years old. So we don't really know where it's at right now. We believe it's higher. So clearly this is happening. People who are in same-sex relationships, gay men, uh, there's physical abuse happening. So why aren't we talking about it? So according to Kevin L. Ard and Harvey J. McAdon, in 2011, right after that survey was published, intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships can lead to a fear of outing, loss over control of sexual and gender expression, and fear of discrimination in society. So there's a lot there. So fears of outing, fears of somebody saying, like, fears of somebody telling somebody else your sexual orientation before you have the time to tell them on your own terms. Loss over control of sexual and gender expression, losing that fear of losing that ability to control your own story, control your own narrative, and fear of discrimination in society, fear of not being believed, fear of saying, oh, this can't happen to you because you're a man, because you're a gay man, etc. So there's also a psychological trauma associated with this. So closeted gay men fear losing control over their lives. So a lot of times they won't want to speak up and talk about this because they fear being outed. That's one of the biggest senses of fear that's across all the scholarship. That's one of the biggest reasons why gay men don't share their experiences as frequently. And there's also that fear, stigma, shame associated with sexual identity, but then also with intimate partner violence and abuse. And there are also limited services available for the LGBTQ community. A lot of shelters aren't available for men in general, even less services for the community as a whole. And there's a feeling of being trapped or stuck in the situation because there's not resources. It's very hard to get out. It's very hard to find that way out. And now we're going to talk about power dynamics because this is one of the main reasons why domestic abuse occurs, especially in all relationships and especially gay relationships. So the abuser always wants to be in the position of power and control over the abused, over the victim. So as long as they can keep that position, they're going to do whatever they can to stay there. That's common across every domestic violence case. So the abuser will do whatever he can. I'm using he pronouns because gay male relationships to stay in power. So the common themes in the gay community, as per the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and they have a great extensive list, well, as extensive as it can be with the scholarship we have right now. So again, outing, that's again the biggest theme that's coming across. There's this idea that nobody will believe the victim because of their sexual orientation. So the abuser puts that onto them, making them believe that they are trapped because of their sexual orientation. And then cutting off sources of help. So this is common again in all across all themes of domestic violence, and not letting the victims see their friends, their family, reach out to them and talk to them, justifying the abuse, saying, oh, this person is not really gay because they may have had a female partner in the past or a partner who is gender nonconforming, and that's not really gay. So there's that idea that it's the victim's fault because they may have had previous relationships with others. And there's the idea that claiming the violence is mutual or consensual, which comes up a little bit later in this presentation. And that's one of the biggest factors that we're going to see. The victim will sometimes believe that they're also committing violence or some sort of abuse against their partner, even though they may not be or probably are not. And there's this guise of masculinity thinking men don't get abused, which is completely false. Men can suffer from physical abuse, emotional abuse, domestic violence. It happens. So there's a lot of power dynamic going into this, and there's reasons why the abusers are staying in this position over these other people. So we have the cycle of power and control. It just continuously goes around and around, and we can see the power and control in the center of that circle and the methods that abusers typically use. So this is an interesting diagram because it also includes sexuality. So we can see power and control is very common among uh, all to most domestic assault and domestic violence cases. So we can see using coercion threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, denying, minimizing, blaming, children, privilege, and economic abuse, which I just covered in the last slide, but also it's spelled out a little bit more clearly here. So if you'd like to pause and read this, you totally can, but go ahead. But then we can see that outer circle with heterosexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and we see how all those can also be a system that's playing into this, another layer on top of the violence that's already occurring. So there's homophobia at play with uh, the guise of masculinity and what masculinity should look like, but also saying that you won't be believed if you speak out about your abuse because you're a gay man. So there are themes there that are playing into the power and control that are making it really hard for gay men to speak out and to speak up about what is occurring to them. And not even just gay men, any member of the LGBTQ plus community. Now, leaving is not so simple because this is also a common myth that the Human Rights Campaign talks about in their myths and busts. I linked it at the bottom or at the last slide. So leaving is not as easy as people may think because again, there's a lack of resources for LGBTQ plus domestic violence survivors. So better resources, cities are typically better for this because cities usually have some sort of support system, whereas more rural communities do not. And there's this lack of believability due to underrepresentation. So there's this fear that gay men speak out, they won't be believed because they're not represented in the scholarship. They're not represented in the narratives that we hear, typically coming out of domestic violence situations. And then there's the idea that the abuser is typically in control of the victim in some way. I wouldn't say that's an idea, that's a fact. The abuser is trying to keep that position of power and control. And we could see it through like rent and mortgage payments or like combined or somehow like the victim is associated with that in some way, joint bank accounts, children in some cases, cell phones, tracking cell phones, etc. So there's a long list of things that can make the person feel trapped, make the victim feel trapped in the situation. And there's one more major thing that I already touched on earlier, but I'm going to spell it out here. It's called the myth of mutual battering. I just want to make sure I got it right. The myth of mutual battering. And this is the idea that basically means the victim sees himself as the perpetrator or a perpetrator in the situation, even though he is not one. So the victim is not committing any acts of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, but they are believing that they are. So this falls into the trap that men can't abuse men, which again is completely false. And the perpetrator wants to keep the sense of power and control. So they're going to let the victim believe that they are also committing an act of violence and play into that because the abuser will identify with that and allow that to continue to occur. So the victim will believe that they are also being abusive and that it becomes normalized. And this is a major factor of abuse in same-sex relationships. There's this continuous questioning of the self. Am I being abused? Is this actually abuse? Is it abuse that a man is abusing another man? So there's all these questions that go into it that make it really complicated and tricky for gay men to speak out. Okay, I was struggling there for a second. So how to help those who are being assaulted. So here's some tips that you can use. If this was a workshop, we would have workshopped these strategies together, but for sake of time and for sake of this being virtual, I'm going to give you some of those strategies now. So when somebody comes to you and tells you that they've been abused, believe them. That's the first thing that you can do. Listen to them and believe them. Secondly, there needs to be more representation of LGBTQ abuse in domestic violence occurrences and in the scholarship itself, because without that representation, there won't be really any actual headway in making sure that these populations are represented in the scholarship. So another reason is, or another example is tell your story. There's a great memoir called In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado that came out. She's a lesbian woman who details her experiences with intimate partner violence and domestic abuse, and I think it's fantastic. But this idea of telling your story is super important. And then assist with resources, which are available on the next slide. If somebody needs those resources, give them to them, reach out to them. Also knowing some of the signs of abuse, which we've detailed here, by knowing those, you're already more apt to pick up on themes of abuse and see that it is occurring in certain situations. Talk to your own friends and family. Keep up with them, catch up with them, see where they are in their own personal relationships, and just reach out and be present in people's lives. And that way you can be a source of help, whether it's, I'm sure it's not going to be like direct intervention, but if you can give them some help or resources or even just an ear to listen, that makes a world of difference. So here are some of the resources if you need them ever, whatever case, if you need it now, if you need it later. Here are resources that are national and then local to BGSU. I know we're all in various different parts of the country right now, or even the world. So we have national resources for the United States and then local to BGSU. So we have the Gay Men's Domestic Violence Project Hotline, which is smaller, but it is 24/7. The National Sexual Assault Hotline, again, 24/7. The LGBT National Help Center, 24/7, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline 24/7, which is probably the most prominent national domestic violence hotline that we have. And then local to BGSU, if you visit the Center for Violence Prevention and Education's website, you can find more detailed information there. I know in the BGSU area, there's the Cocoon, and there are other resources available through them on their website, and you can always feel free to reach out to them, and they would be more than happy to help you get you the resources that you need. And here's some of my contact information. But before we get there, um, also keep checking up on people at this time as well, because COVID-19 with quarantine has been keeping people isolated. And this is a very, very bad time for people who are in domestic violence situations because they are essentially stuck with their abusers for so long. So if you can in any way keep up with people in relationships, keep up with them, keep with your friends and family, and make sure that they are okay and they're staying safe and staying healthy. And if this was a workshop like originally planned, I would have had examples and we would have workshopped some materials. So this is more of a presentation style. But if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, please feel free to reach out. I am more than happy to help or assist in any way that I can. My email is there for you, oharry@bgsu.edu. And if there's something that I can't answer, I will find you the answer and I'll make sure that you get your questions answered. And again, this is all about representation, because without representation, there can never be any real changes. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Here's some works that I have referenced. The link with the asterisk is for further reading. It's really, really interesting. I thought it was fascinating. I would have used that in a workshop setting to bring in examples and bring in materials and objects. But then these are also the references that I used for this presentation. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to reach out. Thanks.